Welcome, everybody, to BeerSmith Podcast number 69. It's early November 2013. We got a great guest today. It's going to be John Mallett from Bell's Brewery, so I'm looking forward to interviewing him. Reminders for you, we got BeerSmith 2.2 coming out probably sometime in the next few weeks. I'm going to have a preview for that coming out on the blog within the next week. So keep an eye on the BeerSmith blog at beersmith.com/blog and learn about some of the new features there. 2.2 will be a free upgrade for anybody that does own BeerSmith. So if you haven't picked up your copy, please go ahead and grab that today. You can go to beersmith.com and download a free 21-day trial. It's top-selling beer brewing software in the country. Now, without further ado, let's jump into this week's episode. Today on the show, my guest is John Mallett. He's been at Bell's Brewery in Kalamazoo, Michigan since 2001. He's Director of Operations, responsible for logistics, brewing, packaging, and brewery capital projects. He's also been involved in other organizations, including Master Brewers Association, the Brewers Association, the American Malting and Barley Association, and the Hop Quality Group. He's taught at the Seibel Institute of Technology and was head brewer at Boston's Commonwealth Brewery and Old Dominion Brewery in Ashburn, Virginia. He's also the president of SAS. John, it is fantastic to have you on the show.
Well, thanks so much for having me. This is nice to get a chance to talk to you a little bit.
We were going to talk a little bit about hops and malt today, and I really appreciate you being here. So I thought we'd start talking. You want to talk a little about the malt and hop supply and how it affects beer brewing for home brewers. So I thought I'd give you a chance to first talk about some of the challenges in running a commercial brewery like Bell's.
Yeah, it's an interesting job to run a big brewery. We're a craft brewery and we keep growing, and as you grow and grow, every year it seems like we're adding on new equipment and staff and processes, and that's a really great opportunity to have. So when I think about some of the challenges, it's probably like every job. The biggest variable is people, and so you spend a lot of time talking to people and trying to get ultimately what is a fantastic product out the door. And, for us at Bell's, the way that we kind of approach that and the way that we've approached that for a long time is, we love to make beer, and if the beer ain't right, we're not going to make it. So, before production comes quality. So it's really hard to focus on, it'd be hard to focus on production and then focus on quality. So focus on quality first. And I think that when we started thinking about that a little more, we thought, as Charlie Bamforth, great brewing educator, once said, take care of the people, and the people will take care of quality. So to get great quality, you need to put the energy into great people. And then really what that means for us at Bell's, the way that manifests itself is the most important thing is people come in the door, they know that they're going to walk out with 10 fingers, 10 toes under their own power. So we really focus on safety. And that's the very first thing we do. So safety, morale, quality, and we'll talk about production after that. So in terms of actually running the brewery day to day, working with people and working with raw materials, it's a changing landscape out there. And it's changing in the raw material supply markets, in terms of getting malt and getting hops and getting the right malt and the right hops and the right quality of malt and the right quality of hops. And so that's something that we at Bell's and myself, we really focus a lot on. And I think that as home brewers and commercial brewers, we all recognize that there's been times when hop prices go up or down and hops are more difficult to find. Or as commercial brewers, we look at things analytically in the brew house and think, wow, malt's changing. 2010 is different than 2009, and that's changing the beer a little bit. And so the challenge there is, how do you consistently output a product, a great product, when faced with these changing raw material supplies? So that's a big focus of what we do.
Well, let's talk about hops first then. How does breeding and
hops are sexy. Let's go hops. Yeah.
Well, they're cool. We'll get the malts too in a minute, but how does the breeding and growing of hops really play a significant role in developing great beer?
Well, you look back at sort of the hop industry and the hop varieties that are out there and available for us, and I think we all recognize how much stuff has changed over time. And the way that what I think about that is, back when I first started getting into brewing 20 some odd years ago, we didn't have a lot of the varieties that we have today.
Yeah.
And those varieties have come up and continue to come up. And, this year we've got, last year we got Mosaic, and there's some fantastic hops out there. Amarillo's not been around for all that long. Citra. These are hops that were not available, 10 years ago. Simcoe, the backbone of so many fantastic beers. That hop, again, not been around for, in the grand scheme of things, all that long. So if we just look at a short 10-year period, we've seen all of these new hops come in that really redefine how hops taste in beer. And you see that over in Europe when I'm over there. There's a number of American craft style breweries or craft style beers, and they're relying on American hops. And the Germans are responding by attempting to grow similar hops. Things like there's a couple of new varietals. There's 4 new varietals that came out of the breeding program in Hull. Mandarina Bavaria, Polaris. These hops that are the offspring of Cascade and German varietals like Hallertau. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to ask, do you think the craft beer industry is driving a lot of the, better quality and variety we're seeing in the industry, in the hops industry?
Well, it's interesting that, Citra as a hop was around for a while, mm-hmm. and it was developed, and when it was developed for a specific brewer and large brewer, and the large brewer said, boy, this stuff just tastes way too citrusy, like throw it out of the program. We don't want it. It's no good. And so it was relegated, and should have been destroyed, really. It was going nowhere. Mm-hmm. And with American craft beers coming up and these styles of beers coming up, at some point somebody says, oh, you like citrus? Well, we got this hop you should probably check out. And Citra then blows up. And, now it's a fantastic hop for the growers, and it's a, fantastic hop for the brewers. So, Citra would have died a death had we been down to, large industrial beer only. So I would say the answer to that is, yeah, craft drives some hops.
And I think it's also played a role in increasing the quality, right? I mean, have you seen a change in the processing and storage and availability of a lot of these hops?
Well, the story of hops is a very interesting story. With coming now into in recent years, that industry has been in the Yakima Valley and the Willamette Valley and parts of Idaho for a while, and those are family businesses, and it's a small specialty crop. Those businesses don't do all that great for many years, and for many of them, they are below the cost of production. So as a farmer, you're putting in, $3.50 or whatever that number is per pound to grow this. And in the end, you got to sell it for $3. And that's not a long-term sustainable, successful business model.
Yeah.
So, if you look back in hops, not that many years ago, the kids are leaving the farm. The number of farmers are declining. They're getting older. And because, you can go work for Microsoft, go across the mountain and work for Microsoft. Then the way that model actually works is that periodically, because you've been losing 50 cents a pound for years and years, that every once in a while there's a shortage. The market corrects itself. Mm-hmm. Enough people get out, and all of a sudden there's a shortage. And now all of a sudden there's hops that are $20 a pound. And everybody says, this is a crime because, I used to buy hops for $3 and now I'm buying them for $20 and somebody's getting rich. And really what's happening is, on average, those farms are barely surviving.
That was about 2010, right?
Yeah, that was the last time, but it's a cyclical event, and it happens about every 10 years that the market sort of comes into this flipping piece. And so I've been through it a couple times, and it's never pretty as a brewer. Mm-hmm. You're like, I thought we were doing okay. It was something that drove us towards contracting fairly early on. And, the contract, you say, hey, we're going to buy 3 years worth of hops. So, you're selling this year's crop and next year's and the year after that, and we're going to do it for a sustainable price.
Right.
So, in the midst of all this, in that last cycle, there's another thing that happens, and that is that Anheuser-Busch has always had a quality team that would be out there on the fields. Interacting with growers, on a first name basis with growers, and this quality team really did a huge service for all of craft. And as a craft brewer, I never knew that. I didn't really know that Anheuser-Busch was paying a visit to every farmer that I was buying from directly or indirectly, and walking in and saying, hey, we love buying hops from you, but you got to clean up this or that, or making clear quality pieces.
Right.
So back a number of years ago, the Anheuser-Busch, as they were bought out by InBev, mm-hmm. and they looked at that structure and they said, we're going to get rid of this auditing function. We're changing the way we use our hops. And they fired the guy who was, they dissolved the position of the guy who ran that program. And he was a guy who, actually taught me about hops when I went to Siebel back in, 1989, 1990. Mm-hmm. So very well-respected guy by the name of Val Peacock. And there was a bunch of brewers that were together. We were at the Master Brewers Convention in Providence. And, the topic came up that, the hop quality guide that we've all been relying on, whether we know it or not, is now gone. So, in other words, they just fired the sheriff.
Right.
And I think we've all seen enough Westerns to know where that goes. So the group of these brewers got together. There was like 5 or 6 of us, and we all got together and said, maybe none of us can do this alone, but maybe together we could do something. So at that point, we formed up this group called the Hop Quality Group. Mm-hmm. Very imaginative name.
Yeah, creative.
Yeah, that's kind of our forte, right, brewers?
Absolutely.
So the Hop Quality Group, we really went in and attempted to interact with growers and start to talk to them about quality. And I'll tell you, it was really interesting because, at first, you went into this as a group, this en masse, and this is like, Boston Beer and Sierra Nevada and Bell's and New Belgium. And,
some of the larger ones, yeah.
Yeah, Deschutes. I mean, these are, people who might know something about hops, you'd hope. Walked in, and the first thought was, oh, my God, they're probably here to, hammer us on pricing or do something. Really what we wanted to do was to be friends and to start a dialogue. And as we started to talk to the growers and the brokers, we would say, we're interested in quality. And the first answer they had was, well, we got quality covered. You don't need to worry about that. We got quality covered. And the second question we had was, how do you define quality? And they kind of looked at us and said, well, the same way you guys do, right? So what is that? And for us, that's not about how much bittering substance there is in the hops. That's about how much flavor there is in the hops. When we're doing selection, I really don't care about how much bitterness we can put in the beer with this particular hop. We're really interested in how much flavor impact that hop is going to put into the beer.
Sure.
And that's the case with all these brewers. So as we started to switch the discussion away from alpha acid and towards oils, aromatic oils, this was really a great thing. So, right now the Hop Quality Group is running something it's called the Cascade Cup. So at the annual Hop Growers Convention, we now have this open contest. Bring your best cut of Cascades. The hop selection people from some of these very hop focused breweries are going to rub the cuts and decide which is the best cut, and then let everybody else kind of take a sniff at that. And the hope is that we can raise the tide for everybody, so that it's not like that any one company is going to get the best hops, but all of us together, craft, homebrew, worldwide, are all getting great and increasingly high-quality hops.
Yeah, I've seen a huge change since I started brewing in '87, and seen a huge change in the quality of hops and actually all the ingredients that are available.
Hey, the hops back then were, sketchy at best.
Yeah, and there weren't many available.
Exactly.
Well, I want to know, a lot of people don't know how hops are actually processed and stored. Could you walk through that real quick? I think it'd be maybe an interesting discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. So, hops are there's hops being grown over many parts of the country now. But the hop industry has been really centered in the Yakima and Willamette Valley for the past many years. So they're grown on trellis systems, and that trellis system looks like a field with a bunch of telephone poles in it, and across the top of the telephone poles there's wires, and hanging down from the wires there is just a string, and the hop vine will climb up the string as it grows through the season, and finally it comes into fruition, and it's time to harvest. And usually harvest is happening about the end of August or so.
Mm-hmm.
So for them, they'll go into harvest the hops. They'll pull the entire vine, as it's known, the whole vine, and bring it back to a processing facility on the farm, and it's just a picking machine, and it strips away the cones. And the cones, after they're stripped away, they're separated from leaf and stem material, and then the cones are then conveyed over to a dryer. Mm-hmm. And what the dryer looks like is it's a, picture like a 32-foot by 32-foot mesh floored space, with little, half walls on it. And underneath that mesh wall, underneath that mesh bottom, there are big air fans that are blowing air in, and burners to heat the air up, and basically you're pushing hot air up through a bed of hops. And over time, over the course of some hours, those hops are going to dry out. And so we'll talk in a minute about the temperature, but we are using temperature to drive moisture out of the hops. When they're dry, the hops are then discharged into a pile on the floor where they're allowed to settle for 24 hours and kind of equilibrate their moisture. And then they're baled, and bales are 200-pound compressed blocks of hops. And then those hops make their way over to generally a hop broker. So this is somebody like a hop union. And hop union will receive the hops, they sample them, they put them in a cooler, and they sit there until they're ready to take the next step. Now, some breweries and some brewers will use hops in the whole flower form, and that's they're just going to ship them in a truck to the brewery from there. For those of us who use pellets, the next step is we got to get them pelletized. And so what the pelletizing process looks like is they will take the bale and they'll break the bale up, and then the hops are then passed into a hammer mill. And that hammer mill is basically a set of rapidly spinning metal pieces that just pulverize the hop, and this hop powder then is conveyed up eventually into a pelletizing die. And what it is it's just basically compressing them through a form, and they're being extruded out and knocked off, and that's how we end up with hops that they're looking like stove pellets or rabbit food or whatever. So that's the way most of us are using hops. Beyond that, we could then take those pellets and do what they call downstream products. So we might take those pellets and put them into a giant high pressure system and pump in liquid CO2, and that liquid CO2 will carry away all of the oils and the bitterness and leave behind the leaf and stem material. And so at that point, we would end up with like a tarry goo, which is hop extract and pretty pure stuff. From there, they might take it and fraction it off, so they separate the oils away from the alpha and beta acids and do more treatments to it and do chemical wizardry that will make it impervious to being light struck. And these are some pretty high chemistry, cool stuff that goes on. Right,
because a lot of hop extracts you can store for a long time, right?
Oh, the hop extracts store for a really long time, and I think that this is, for the large brewers, is is really saved them well, that they get much higher efficiency. You can use hop extract after fermentation.
Right.
You don't lose any in the yeast, and you're they're very, very efficient at it, at turning it, just making beer bitter. I think that personally, I really like the flavor of hop oil, and I like the flavor of the whole hop. If you just fraction away the oil, it somehow doesn't. That's not a flavor I'm as big a fan of. So, I mean, that's really the way hops are processed. And you think about, well, what are some of the things that could go wrong? And hops are perishable, so age, number one. If we pelletize them and then they sit somewhere for years, they're not going to do well. We're going to destroy some of those, those very delicate and lovely oils. We can also destroy delicate and lovely oils through
heat.
Through heat, because that's going to accelerate the aging. So keeping them cold is of utmost importance. And that heat could come in a lot of different ways. Heat can be, from storage or transport, or just hanging out in your homebrew closet. Or
you want to keep them in the fridge, right?
Yeah, exactly. Or freezer, even better.
Freezer's better, yeah.
But you could also do that through the pelletizing die. I mean, there's some heat that's required to make a pellet, and so if the pellet die is being run incorrectly, you could get poor quality through there. It's just like taking great beer and putting it through a very bad bottling machine. The other place we've seen is on that drying stage in the hop kiln. We actually have sponsored some research. The Hop Quality Group sponsored some research and was just showing it that to look at how much oils are lost through high temperature, if they run the kilns a little too hot or too hot. So that's another place I think that there's some real additive effects. So as the takeaway here is hops are perishable just like beer. Keep it cold just like beer. You can freeze it, not just like beer. And those are all great things to do. And, just making sure that you got good, fresh ingredients. I think this is absolutely critical.
So let's move on to brewing for a minute. What are some of your favorite hop techniques that you like to use for homebrewing beer?
Well, back if you read Byron Birch or whatever, what the hopping schedules are, and those hopping schedules have certainly evolved over time. And as a brewer, I love dry hopping, and that's something that's really starting to take on the world. The Germans recently sort of had a reevaluation of Reinheitsgebot and determined that, in fact, that hops could be added in fermentation. So there's currently a lot of interest over in Germany about dry hopping and some of the flavors. So dry hopping, absolutely. In terms of dry hopping, I think that fermentation temperature and yeast activity has a lot to do with the way the hops express. So that depending on how clear the beer is and depending how warm the beer is, you're going to get different things out of the hops. And some brewers say, we always want to put hops in at this stage of the process. And other brewers say, we want to put stuff in at this stage of the process. And that's really a matter of personal choice. We'll do a little bit of each because we kind of like both things. We like having that breadth.
So, on dry hopping, are you a fan of, doing it short contact times, long contact times, do it different during active fermentation, post-fermentation? What's your favorite?
Yes, I am.
All of them. Okay.
All of them. I mean, if you're looking to make, if we're looking to make different beers, why not use different techniques?
Sure.
And this is a great, great thing to talk to friends about and to debate, maybe having a couple beers while you debate it, about what you like and why you like it. And I do notice that, there's certain beers that I'll taste, more myrcene and more, that real piney kind of character. And to me, that's a sign that, they're probably dry hopping colder, and later in the process, Mm-hmm. So what you're pulling out of the hop, I think, varies. There's a set of very interesting the compounds called glycosides, and these are sugars bound to aromas. And with some yeast activity, the yeast will basically cleave away the sugar to eat it. And when it cleaves it away, that means that now there's this aroma molecule that was previously locked up. So in the case of some analytical that we've seen, you'll see actually an increase in certain aromas over time if there's yeast activity.
Very cool.
Yeah, so I think this is an awesome thing to play with, and doing it on any scale, homebrew, commercial scale, would be this is a pretty cool thing.
Other hop techniques you like?
We do something called Nomi every once in a while.
What is that?
That's basically no minute. So basically no hops in boil.
So you just do Whirlpool only, or
yeah, Whirlpool only, and that gets that that Nomi style gets to be you get some different flavors out of there, and you still get a fair amount of bitterness conversion, more than initially than we thought, and as the nice thing with running a brewery is the ability to get analysis tools and actually see what you're doing, and you're like, holy cow.
Yeah, I found one good paper recently that said that you get about half the utilization at 190 degrees that you might get boiling, for example, which isn't that bad, really. If you can, because as a commercial brewer, like you can keep the Whirlpool hops fairly hot for an extended period of time. So, yeah,
and again, I don't really, if I want to get bitterness in a beer, I can get that upstream. It's the loading it up, just loading it with flavor. That's the thing that interests us, I think.
And a lot of those oils are very volatile, right?
Oh yeah.
So you can't really boil them off.
Yeah.
Or you can if you're not careful, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
So that's where the Whirlpool hops come into play. Well, let's switch over to malts for a few minutes. What role does breeding and farming play in creating good malts?
Well, that's a great question. And it's a question that is not really, we're just starting to explore this a little bit more. So it's interesting that you look at breeding of hops and of malt. And both of them, that process is similar in some ways in that it takes a long time. Both of them are about a 10-year progression. And as any plant breeder will tell you, that breeding is a numbers game. And what that means is that you make a lot of crosses. So they'll take and cross these, and every offspring is unique and different. And then it's just a process of sifting through it. So what are they sifting for? Well, for both malt and hops, they're looking at it agronomically, first of all. The farmers are not really interested in growing something that's not going to grow. So if you come out with this new barley type that yields half of what they're currently growing, hey, you should grow this and make half as much per acre. It's not going to go anywhere. The other thing that they're looking for is disease resistance, and there's a whole host of diseases that can attack both malt and hops.
Right.
And so if you can breed in disease resistance, then that's a real plus. So agronomics, disease resistance, and now you start getting into yield and performance in different climates. And eventually you get down to the process where on the malt side where, hey, this stuff looks great. It's got great resistance to DON. The lodging numbers look good. The yields are better than, the current varieties. We should malt some and see if it malts. So then they'll bring it up to put it through a pilot malting and see, does it have germinative capacity? Is it going to work? And at that point, after a couple of years of doing that and, hey, this looks like a winner and we're going to make some seed increase now and, get beyond the handful of plants up to maybe, an acre or a couple acres. At that point, they harvest it and send it to a commercial malt house and then say to the brewers, hey, we got a new barley. Do you want to try it out? Now, this is the first time that anybody's talked about flavor.
Right.
In the whole process. We're like in year 8 right now.
Yeah.
And nobody's even looked at flavor.
Well, as long as the yield's good, that's good, right?
Exactly. And really a lot of the barley in this country has been bred from a pretty narrow gene stock. And that narrow gene stock, produces malts that are, pretty, they go well through the brew house. They function well. If you're, big brewer who's interested in throughput, they're going to work well. They're not going to give you problems.
Right.
And maybe, where flavor fits in, not as important. So right now, what's happening is there's a couple of brewers that are very interested in saying, what's the breadth of flavor that we could look at? So they're using some science. We're using some science called metabolomics, which is looking at all of the metabolites that are involved there. We're also currently there's a project right now that Dr. Pat Hayes out at Oregon State University in Corvallis is doing, and there's a couple of brewers that are involved with this, where he is growing what they call the World Core Collection. So the World Core Collection is basically all of these barley types from all over the world that were collected, and there's an incredible variety of barleys that are out there, stuff from, the barley as a plant starts out in Ethiopia and sort of moves with humans. And, there's, one subset that comes across to Morocco and goes through Mexico and ends up in California.
Well, they've been growing it forever, sure.
And so there's these different types, but, virtually all of the barley in this country is coming out of this really narrow pool. So Pat's question is, if we grow out this World Core Collection and we start tasting worts and beers, what do these different ones do? Because I'll tell you that as a brewer, if somebody came to me and said, we have a malt that is unique and delicious and it's one of those things that you just taste it and you just envision the beer. You put the malt in your mouth and you say, I know the beer this is going into. And then they come back to you and say, and by the way, it costs, yields a third less, so it's going to cost a third more. What do I care? I'm going for it. Yeah. So, as a large brewer, you probably wouldn't be able to make that argument, but for us, that would be very, very interesting. Or
for a home brewer, I'd be willing to spend a couple more dollars a batch.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Wouldn't we all? I mean, you just think about pulling that one out on your buddy, and he's like, how did you do this? Whatever. Yeah. So, I think that, you look back at these different barley varieties, and, there's a lot more there than 2-row and 6-row. And, for the most part, you talk to many brewers, and you ask them what kind of barley you use, and they're going to say, we use 2-row. And, the question is what is the underlying barley variety? Do you know that? And that's kind of cool, The one that I think that people know is Maris Otter.
Yeah.
I don't know. Do you
Very
use that?
Popular. Oh, yeah, I use Maris Otter. Love it.
And this is a variety that's pretty old. I mean, right now, when you go over to look at the recommended varieties in this country, and the recommended varieties are pretty much all of them. There's like one or two exceptions that they're all less than 10 years old, and most of them are less than 5 years old. So they're rapidly cycling through this pretty narrow gene stock. And then you get to something like Maris Otter, which is pretty old.
Right.
And that's a real rarity. It doesn't yield very well. It costs more. Personally, I think it tastes delicious.
Yeah, it's great for English ales and almost anything, really.
And, you think about it as a brewer, how does it perform in the brew house? You think it's, Maris Otter is a barley that gives up the extract easily. You don't fight with it. It's it's very interesting to me. So, right now that variety is owned by one guy, one concern, named Robin Appel over in England. And, they really drive that. They really drive that. So.
Absolutely. Well, let's switch over. We talked a little bit about varieties. Let's switch over and talk about, how the processing and kilning of the malts plays a significant role in developing flavor. Maybe just walk us through the basic process too.
Yeah. So when we think about malting, we're really talking about 3 steps, and the 3 steps are steeping, germination, and kilning. So steeping, we're going to, take the barley as the barley comes off the field. It's fairly dry, and we're going to introduce moisture to it, basically flood it and allow it to uptake a bunch of moisture. And the moisture is going to come up quite a bit. And really what this is signaling to the barley kernel is that, hey, spring has come. The warm spring rains are here, and it is time to grow. So, that barley, just like if the ground had thawed and rains had come, it's going to uptake all of this moisture and start to want to grow. So
Sure.
that steeping process, takes a couple days. There's some water changes, and then the barley seed is turned out. The barley kernels are turned out into a big germination bed. So what the germination bed looks like is, well, a mesh floor with air underneath it blowing up, kind of like a hop kiln in some ways, but very different. And so as it's turned out into this mesh floor on these large mesh floors, it's allowed to start to germinate. And that germination process can take 4 days, 5 days. It's dependent on temperature. It's dependent on moisture, and the maltster really has some control about the way that happens. Mm-hmm. And depending on moisture and temperature conditions, the way that the malt develops these are levers that can control how that changes. Sure. So fundamentally, what's happening there is that let me back up for a second. Okay. So at the end of this germination phase, we then would put it into a kiln, and the kiln again is just another mesh floored area with air blowing through it. This time it's heated, and as the hot air comes through, it's going to cause the barley to sweat like we would sweat, and the barley is giving up moisture. It's not really changing its temperature, but it's giving up moisture, and then finally, once most of the moisture is out of it, now the temperature inside the barley starts to raise, and that's the kilning step. So what's really happening in malt is a couple things. Thinking about barley is this package of the young germ, the embryo that will be the plant, and then a food source, which is all of this carbohydrate, starch, which is stored in there, and then the whole thing is covered with a wrapper, and that wrapper is the husk, protecting the grain. Mm-hmm. And as anybody who's made beef barley soup could attest, you take a handful of barley seed, and you throw it in your mouth and try to chew it, you're about going to break a tooth. Yeah. I mean, it's hard stuff. And that's very different than malt. So what's happening is that why it's hard is that the whole package has got a structure, a protein structure that's really protecting those starch granules. It is giving the whole thing structure and rigidity. And the malting process is breaking down some of those protein structures. And when we've completely modified the malt, we've now made it very mellow. The word for this is friable. You can break it up. You can break it up easily. So that friability, to get to that friability, what we've done is we've broken down some proteins, but we've also broken down some starches as well. Sure. And the starches, I think about starches, looks a lot like, starch is basically a sugar linked to a sugar linked to a sugar in very long chains, very big chains. And these very large chains, as they become broken down, that's what we as brewers are doing. We know that, but there's also a little bit that's happening of that in malting. So the longer you malt it, the more conversion you get, or the more modification you get, the more you're losing, the more that starch you're losing. So a maltster takes 100 pounds of barley and doesn't turn it into 100 pounds of malt. They're going to lose almost 20%. So in the end, they're going to end up with like 80 pounds of malt. As that whole thing is broken down, we've had some enzymatic activity, certainly on the proteins, but also on the starches. And so at this point, we have these fragments of proteins, which are called amino acids, mm-hmm. and we've got fragments of starches, which we call sugars, and it's all inside of this moist environment. Now, there's a really interesting set of reactions that occur called the Maillard reactions. And the Maillard reactions are caramelization-like reactions. So true caramelization occurs at very high temperatures, right. Does not require you can just take straight sugar, you can put it in a pan, and you can caramelize it. Maillard reactions make similar flavored, but at much lower temperatures. And what it is it's the combination of sugars and amino acids and moisture and heat. And these Maillard reaction products are responsible for all the flavors that we associate with chocolate, with coffee, roasting, bread. You think about
caramel,
bread crust. Right? Oh my God! I mean, there's just huge, variety of flavors, and all of those factors are there in the kiln. So upstream of the, upstream as you're in the germination bed, you're creating all of the substrate required to do this. So the way that the brewers, or the way that the maltsters are going to malt that grain or kiln that grain, really can enhance those Maillard reaction products. One of the key ones that I think about there is one called maltol. And you can only guess what the flavor of maltol is. It is that malty flavor. There's another set of ones called pyranizans, which are just fantastic. I think of these as, you sort of think about that great German, lager beer, the fest beer, and it's just got this, this
malty flavor. Sure.
Oh my God, that's the flavor. That's the flavor.
Doesn't the Maillard reaction also play a significant role when we start brewing from extracts, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So Maillard reaction products do not finish in the malt house at all. If you look at an industrial light lager beer, over half of the color comes from Maillard reaction in the kettle. So the wort goes in at, if you're coming out with a beer that's got a 2.5 color, the wort may have gone into the kettle at a 1.0 and picked up 1.5 in the kettle. And, that gives flavor, it gives color. So this is all throughout the, through the hot side of the brewing process.
I was wondering if you could just share a few things about brewing with specialty malts that a lot of home brewers maybe don't know or aren't aware of.
Yeah, so I think about, I want to back up for a minute and talk.
No, go ahead.
Speak to your question about extracts. So extracts are really interesting to me because if you're making a high gravity beer, and if I say, hey, I want to make a high gravity beer, and I run word off, and I end up with a I'm aiming for a 1080 or something like this, and I run it into the kettle at say 1065, and I think I have a way to fix this. I'm going to boil it. And so I'm going to boil it. 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 And eventually I get it all the way up to 1080. Mm-hmm. Well, the entire time I'm doing that boiling, I've got amino acids, I've got sugars, I've got moisture, and I've got heat. So I'm making my wort is going to get darker and darker. And in addition to being darker and darker, I'm also then changing those Maillard reaction products. They're making color, but they're also making flavor. So I'm really changing that. So with extract, if you were playing with this and you say, I want to make a beer 1080, but I want to make it really pale, that would be an excellent way to reduce some of the thermal stress on that.
But say a few words about how extracts are made, because I think it's important, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So if you go to an extract plant, it's kind of cool. It's basically it's usually at a malt house, and basically at that malt house they have a brew house. Mm-hmm. So I've been in an extract plant that 200 barrel brew house, good sized brew house, and they're going through the mashing process. They're going through the lautering process. They get it up to the kettle, to heat it up. And at that point, what they'll do is they'll take that wort and run it through a concentrator. So the concentrator is, in some cases might be what they call a triple effect vacuum
system.
So what they're doing is that we know that it takes longer to cook a pot of spaghetti up in the mountains of Colorado than it does on the coast in the Carolinas. And the reason for that is that less air pressure. Mm-hmm. So less air pressure, it boils at a lower temperature. So we could actually take hot wort from a kettle, introduce it into a vessel with a vacuum on it, and it's going to want to give up energy by boiling and producing steam. And now it's boiling at a very low temperature. So not many Maillard reaction products, not as many Maillard reaction products being formed. And so these triple effect vacuums, what they're doing is they've got sort of 3 chambers that it goes through and successively lower pressures or higher vacuum in each one. And it's stripping moisture out of there. And so in the end, you're able to get out of this thing, the tarry goo that we call extract. And it's all occurred at a very low temperature. I mean, we could do the same thing. We could get to that kind of tarry goo by boiling in the kettle, or boiling on top of the Cajun cooker. But we're going to end up with something that's black.
Right.
It's just going to.
But I mean, those effects still play a role, though, right? So that's why extract in general ends up being darker than what you could get if you were brewing all grain, right?
Yeah. I think that there's. Yeah, I mean, I think when you get that concentration, a little bit of age, you're going to increase some of that. The way that they do that, they package that as either as the syrup, or they can run it through a spray dryer. And again, it's just going to be, it is a little bit darker, but again, we've had some thermal effects through there.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Well, I was hoping we could go back just for a minute and talk about homebrewing again, and maybe give us a couple examples, a couple tips for homebrewers out there, related to all the things we've been talking about.
Yeah, so I think about when I think about malt as this thing that we're playing with, and a substrate, and it's a combination of amino acids and sugars and flavor. The flavor products therein. One of the things I think that we really do change with is boiling. And boiling, as we put heat stress on beer, it does change. It makes it darker, and it does change the flavor somewhat. And it makes it more prone to oxidative staling as well. Now, for the most part, for homebrew, we've got, ample source of great reducing power in yeast and the ability to call up your buddies and drink this beer before it's getting too old. So, maybe these effects are not as great. I do think, however, that if we are attempting to get a specific set of flavors, that the maltster has really great capabilities that they can play with in the kiln. So when we're talking about the kiln malts, floor malts, really what we're talking about is, pale malt or Pilsner malt, or maybe all the way up to Munich malt.
Right.
But as we start to get up towards caramel malt or get into some of the roasted products, that's occurring in a different piece of equipment. And that different piece of equipment is basically a giant coffee roasting machine that's got really good moisture control in it as well. So to make a caramel malt, what the maltster's looking to do is to take this very green malt and raise the temperature up, so that you've got all this moisture in the grain still, and we raise the temperature up to mashing temperature and basically mash inside the kernel of the grain. So we're breaking down starches into sugars. We've got these amino acids that are there from the proteins, and they're starting to interact in these Maillard reactions inside of the kernel of grain. And so as they sort of tumble it around and keep the temperature and humidity even, and at some point we're starting to get color development, and after a certain amount of color development, then it's time to get rid of the moisture and stop that process. So as a brewer, I think, how do I, if I was looking to do this, I was looking to get the most flavor out of this. I know that Maillard reaction products are driven off of amino acids, and amino acids are a function of proteins, and protein levels in grain vary.
Sure.
So the question is, a lot of brewers say, I never use 6-row malt because, the high protein levels. And I think maybe on these, you're looking for high protein. And I think that's an interesting question, to play with that. I really look at the way that those Maillard reaction products are done up. And, at one point, beer was sort of designed to, we're going to get this color, and we can do that by either using, 1 pound with, at a 500 color, or you can use 50 pounds at a 10 pound color.
Right.
But we know that the colors are very different. And beyond that, of course, the flavors are very different.
Oh, yeah.
So when you look at drinking, large scale industrial beers, a lot of these beers are all about just having a very clean taste. There's not a lot of flavor there. So as brewers, we might say, I really like to have some of that maltier character. I really want to taste like I'm drinking something malty in there. Mm-hmm. And how do we get that? So, mixing in a little bit of a Munich malt or a pale ale malt, or using an all pale ale malt. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you're going to get I think you're going to get very different effects.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Well, John, we're actually running a little bit short on time, but I'd like to have you back maybe again in the spring and talk some more, because I've really enjoyed the talk today. But I was wondering if there's anything else you'd like to add before we close.
I hope everybody's having a beer, because I'm having one, and I hate to have a beer alone, So cheers to that,
Cheers, yeah.
Yeah. So it was a real pleasure to talk to you, Brad. I really enjoyed meeting you, and I look forward to continuing the discussion at some point.
Yeah, I met John at the Homebrew Association meeting this year in Philadelphia. Really enjoyed that, and we had some interesting discussions about your I think it was the Bell's IPA, right?
Yeah. Yeah, Two-Hearted, yeah.
Two-Hearted IPA, which is excellent. I would highly recommend for those of you that haven't tried it. It's kind of a different IPA. But yeah, I enjoyed that, John.
Yeah, it's 100% Centennial. I think it's probably the largest user of Centennial out there in brewing.
Well, so. It's not like over hopped either. Like some people just go crazy with the hops, which I.
Yeah, we make those beers too.
Well, I know, but it's just I think it's good that you do something different. Anyways, John, I really appreciate you being on the show. Thank you for being here.
Well, thanks again so much for having me, Brad. I really appreciate it, and I hope you have a great day.
So again, my guest today was John Mallett. He's at Bell's Brewery in Kalamazoo, Michigan. He's the director of operations there. He's also a member of the Masters Brewers Association, the American Barley Association, the Hop Quality Group. He's lectured at the Seibel Institute, and it's been a great pleasure to have him today on the show.
Cheers.
Well, I'd like to give a big thank you to John Mallett from Bell's Brewery for coming on the show. Really appreciate him being here. It's been a great time. Like to remind you, if you haven't signed up for a newsletter, you can go to beersmith.com/blog and click on the newsletter link at on the sidebar there, or just fill in your email address and name in the sidebar to the right. And we'll send you an article on homebrewing every single week. I'd like to thank you for listening, and I hope you have a great brewing week.